title this one, The Revelation. And leave it at that. Because that's what we're going to talk about. So, Revelation chapter 1, please. As we talk this morning, okay, I'll make up a title. Love and hate. Love and hate. Why love and hate? Well, they're both a part of life, right? And since we're going kind of impromptu this morning, we're going to go back to that part of the Hebrews where Jesus was exalted as being above the angels. It seemed as though, like we said before, when we're going through Hebrews, there was a thing in that particular church where angels, as mighty as they were getting too much credit for their power. And why does that relate to, us as people? See, we don't come from a culture where power is worshipped as much as some cultures, but there are some cultures that exist on the principle of power. So we have a constitution that we revere. And no matter who you're in front of or what your audience is, the whole concept of laws is supposed to give us a little bit of stability that you don't necessarily have in a situation where you grow up in you grow up in a place where the tribal chief is your source of authority, or beyond the tribal chief, the political ruler, or whoever the governing authority of your municipality basically dictates what your reality is going to be. See, there are parts of the world where that is true. And power can become a thing to be worshipped in those parts of the world. But even though we have a constitution and we have laws, we can all look to those points in time when we look to the courts and realize, wait a minute, that's not the outcome I was looking for. Why do people so often say that money influences the judicial process? It's because if you have enough of it, you can buy the kind of lawyer that can spin the truth and make it seem a little bit more like whatever it is you want it to be. So why is it that we look at government as a place where a lobbyist has so much influence, even though we have laws in the Constitution? It's because lobbyists have the opportunity to spread money around in a way that makes the law just a starting point. And so it doesn't look so strange if we look at our own cultural reality in a place where laws are supposed to be the thing that provides us stability, and we realize how those laws can be twisted and manipulated. If we look back to the Hebrews in that light, then it's not so strange to see how they began to worship angels because of their power, and that became a thing that was relevant for them. But why is that something that they took the opportunity to mention there, that Jesus is so much higher than the angels? Because he was going to say, power is not what necessarily makes great in heaven, because he notices this thing about Jesus. The thing that exalted Jesus before he gets to chapter 2, and he says he was made perfect through suffering, was the fact that he loved righteousness and hated wickedness. And the reason why I thought love and hate might be a decent title to wrap this concept up around is a lot of times it's easy for us, if we can get in the mindset to love righteousness, it's easy to love righteousness, but sometimes neglect the responsibility to just as much hate wickedness. And that's what exalted Jesus in heaven. That's what exalted him beyond the angels, not the fact that he was the Son of God, as we heard the man this morning talking about the image of Jesus that we often get of walking around in flip-flops and saying happy thoughts all the time. That's not the image of Jesus we get in the scriptures, right? Because in the opening of the Revelation, John, the disciple whom Jesus loved, one of his closest confidants, fell at his feet as though dead because he was looking into the eyes of one whose eyes were like a flame of fire. And so as we go through the Revelation, these first 7 letters, before the Revelation becomes really prophetic, it functions more like a polygraph. See, because if you can look at these letters to these 7 churches and see no correlations to things that you see in our own church experiences, one of the reasons why when asked this morning, why do you think the preacher would have passed the buck on to another preacher to say some of those harsh things that man had to preach this morning all the way from South Carolina? Titus hit the nail on the head. He's like, those are things you could easily preach here to us today. And I appreciate that. See, because before the Revelation gets symbolic and really complicated, it's really simple. And it's not so much a question of whether or not you can see what Jesus is trying to say to the 7 churches. It's a question of whether or not you choose to see what Jesus is trying to say to the 7 churches, and thus possibly delivering a message that's just as relevant to us. So ultimately with that, as we begin with Revelation. Let's start actually in chapter 2, after he is given the description of Jesus. Having fallen before his feet as though dead. Let's actually back up to chapter 1, verse 12. He's going to give a comprehensive description of Jesus that's going to correlate to each of the letters of the 7 churches that he gives. And we're going to see a distinct piece of Jesus's character brought out to each of these 7 churches that's relevant to what he is trying to tell them. But first of all, Revelation, chapter 12, verse 1. Sorry. Slow down. Revelation chapter 1, verse 12, beginning. Then I turned to see the voice that was speaking to me, and on turning I saw 7 golden lampstands, and in the midst of the lampstands one like a son of man, clothed with a long robe and with a golden sash around his waist. The hairs of his head were white, like white wool, like snow. His eyes were like a flame of fire. His feet were like burnished bronze refined in the furnace, and his voice was like the roar of many waters. In his right hand he held 7 stars, and from his mouth came a sharp 2-edged sword, and his face was like the sun shining in full strength. Verse 17, when I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead. But he laid his right hand on me, saying, fear not. I am the first and the last, the living one. I died, and behold, I am alive forevermore, and I have the keys of death and Hades. Let's stop there. See, because each of those characteristics are going to come through in who he introduces himself as to the 7 churches. Verse 1 of chapter 2, he introduces himself to the church at Ephesus as, to the angel of the church at Ephesus write, the words of him who holds the 7 stars in his right hand and who walks among the 7 golden lampstands. See, he's going to tell some things to Ephesus that require credibility. Why? The strength that they had was the fact that they were able to see through the false claims of false apostles. But what we're going to see is Jesus is going to say, okay, you were able to weed out that which was not true, but I need you to discern whether or not the things that I'm saying through this messenger are true. See, it's one thing to be able to shut out that which is untrue, but you don't ever want your shutter outer to get so good that you're shutting out false things along with truth. See, because that's just being defensive. And how do I know? Well, I think in my day, I might have slipped into that mode where after being fed a line, it just didn't seem like didn't pan out to be what it seemed like it was. Then I get into the mode of rejecting. So much so that when the truth comes, I reject truth. And see, that's one of the enemy's tools. It's to make our walls so high, as we talked about in that whole concept of Paul when he was writing to the Corinthians the second time. Tearing down strongholds is part of what is required for us to make that journey back to God. See, strongholds are huge if we're running into the refuge of the strongholds that God has created. That's much of what David talked about in the Psalms, making God his refuge. But when we begin to make strongholds outside of God, we have things that we need to tear down in order to let his word in. And that's what he's trying to get across to the church at Ephesus, because if you read the words to the church at Ephesus before, you realize that they, in defense of the truth, they left their first love. And in order to get them back there, he was going to need them to be open to the right things. Skipping forward, we're going to go back to Ephesus. Down to Smyrna, he's going to introduce himself as this. And to the angel of the church at Smyrna, write the words of the first and the last who died and came to life. Why is that? Because Smyrna was a church that he was not going to rebuke for its wrongdoing. He was going to have to encourage them, however, to face death with courage. And we have talked about it before when I had to work with that farmer at the church that couldn't afford to pay, but they could fill out my salary with work as a farmhand. The thing I appreciate about that farmer is he went ahead and everything he asked me to do. He set the example, and that's what Jesus is showing here. He's not the one who bypassed the pain of death. He's the one who was the firstborn from the dead. And so when he's talking to the church at Smyrna, he's saying, I have no complaints about what you're doing, but you're about to go through a very difficult, fiery trial. And I need you to know that I'm not simply giving you advice as the advice columnist would sit comfortably behind a keyboard and type out words crafted in the vacuum of suffering. No, I'm telling you as one who has been through the suffering, that you need to endure what you are about to face. Skipping forward to the church at Pergamum at verse 12, likewise of chapter 2. To the angel of the church at Pergamum write the words of him who has the sharp 2-edged sword. Why is that so important? Because so often in Scripture we'll see there are times when the reasons for not doing what God has asked us to do can be so plentiful, so persuasive. At the end of his ministry, Jesus talked about the triptych of 3 parables of the 10 virgins, right? 5 wise, 5 foolish, of the talents given to different servants. 2 servants did well, 1 buried his talent. And that servant that buried his talent was full of excuses. Look here, sir, I know that you are a harsh man, reaping where you have not sown and gathering where you have not scattered. So I buried your talent, and here is what is yours. But that master cut through that servant's excuses with very few pointed words. Likewise, when Saul was commanded to kill, I think it was the Amalekites, and devote them to destruction, he devoted the loathsome things to destruction, but kept the best things for himself. And cutting through Saul's excuses about, well, the people kept these to sacrifice to God, of course. God likes sacrifice, right? Samuel cut through everything that Saul was trying to do by simply saying, what then is this bleating of sheep? And that's the image that we get from God here, when he is the one from whose mouth comes the sharp two-edged sword. He's the one as persuasive as my reasoning might be amongst brethren and sisters. There's coming a time when Jesus is going to be able to cut through the things that I've said with a very short, pointed, sometimes just a question, sometimes just a statement that gets to the heart of what I was really either doing or choosing not to do. That's who he's introducing himself as to the church at Pergamum. Likewise, to the church at Thyatira in chapter 2, verse 18, this is how he introduces himself. And to the angel of the church at Thyatira write the words of the Son of God, who has the eyes like a flame of fire and whose feet are like burnished bronze. Understand this. He is not simply talking about one whose eyes can burn away every kind of facade or impurity. He is once again talking about one whose feet have been burnished in bronze. And if you look back to the book of Malachi at the very end of the Old Testament, God talks about how he is going to refine for himself a people perfected through the pains of fire. And once again, this is not a Jesus who is saying, look here, you jump in the fire so you can be refined. He, having no imperfection at all or no sin at all, was also the first to truly go through the fires of death, a living sacrifice offered up for the sins of the people, not for himself. And so it's not simply him having the wisdom that God could impart by divine wisdom. He has the wisdom that comes through suffering. And if you've ever heard of the expression, I've talked about it before, that 1,000-yard stare that soldiers have. See, war movies are a little bit different for those who haven't been through war. I can't talk as one who's been through war, but I have looked at war movies from nations that have had it destroy their territory. I talked to you last week about having been on the mission field to a place where they were trying to rebuild 20 years after the bomb stopped dropping and the shots stopped ringing out. Generations of kids who still never had to see war are still facing life with that 1,000-yard stare. I saw a movie not too long ago about, I think it was the conflict in Latvia during World War II and how it affected them, and how in a family where a father who was a war hero from World War I led his sons back into battle in World War II because they just needed people. They didn't have enough men to fill the battlefield. Their war movies just look different from ours. Why? Because sometimes when I hear people talking about what it was like to actually be a Navy SEAL in the midst of conflict, to see battle, they don't tell the war stories the same way. Sometimes people do, but there can even be infighting in the Navy SEAL community. When you start seeing people who are writing books about what they did on the mission field, that's putting the lives of people who are currently in active duty in danger. Why? Because they're trying to turn a buck. Why? Because it's popular now to tell those stories. But the people who are trying to overcome the PTSD, when you see them talk about their pain because of the things that they've been through, their war stories look a little bit different than the Hollywood movies and the stories I see them as they're told. So understand how that's the picture that Jesus is painting here. He's not like I simply see through because of a godly insight. I see through because of I know the pain of betrayal. I know what it's like to be tortured, right? I know what it's like to be isolated. And so when he writes in the Beatitudes, blessed are you when you are ridiculed and mocked and isolated and thrown out for the sake of God. He's not saying it as one who's just giving sage advice. He's saying it because he knows the pain of actually having endured it. And that's what he's telling the church at Thyatira. He's saying, look, I know what you're going through, but I see through the degree to which your works are complete but the degree to which you're trying to hide behind your good works because there's some things that are going on that need to be fixed and you don't want to deal with them. He says, I see through because I've been through the pain of being completely faithful, not partially faithful, and hiding behind the things that are already complete. Chapter 3, verse 1, he introduces himself to the church at Sardis and to the angel of the church at Sardis, right? The words of him who has the 7 spirits of God and the 7 stars. Once again, this picture of the 7 spirits is a little bit different. If you skip forward to chapter 4, the beginning in verse 5, John has now been transferred from the words that he's been given to 7 very practical, matter-of-fact churches that actually exist in the region of Asia, up into the heavenlies. And it says he gets a vision of God on his throne. Verse 5 of chapter 4 says, from the throne came flashes of lightning and rumblings and peals of thunder. And before the throne were burning 7 torches of fire, which are the 7 spirits of God. And before the throne there was, as it were, a sea of glass like crystal. Understand how those torches aren't so much giving us the same picture of fire as the kind of fire that would burnish bronze. The kind of heat you can manage through a torch ain't the same kind of heat that you would have to burnish and burn away the impurities of a precious metal. But a torch provides light. And so understand the degree to which the 7 spirits of God are talked about as having gone out into the earth and exposing light into dark places. And if you need a reference for that, please go back to John, a very famous passage, John 3:16. Gives us some insight, written by, most of us believe, this very same apostle. John 3:16 talks about what Jesus did in coming to the world and the response that the world had to his coming. John 3:16. Let's actually skip. You know the gist of John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. But please skip down to verse 19 when it talks about the judgment that his presence brought on the earth. And this is the judgment, that light has come into the world, and people love darkness rather than light because their works were evil. For everyone who does wicked things hates the light and does not come into the light, lest his work should be exposed. But whoever does what is true comes into the light. So that it may be clearly seen that his works have been carried out in God. And please go back to Revelation where we were in chapter 3. And so what he is saying in many ways is that as he is about to talk to the church at Sardis, a church that has, you've probably heard before going through these passages, they have a reputation for being alive, but the reality is that they are dead. He is talking of as one who has sent the 7 spirits out into the world to expose what is really going on. And the question for Sardis is, what are you going to do when what is going on at the congregation is actually exposed and placed under the light? Are you going to be tempted to shrink back from it? Or are you going to welcome the exposure of what needs to be healed where you are at? Skipping forward to the church at Philadelphia, he introduces himself in this way in verse 7. And to the angel of the church in Philadelphia, write the words of the Holy One, the true one, who has the key of David, who opens and no one will shut, and shuts and no one opens. Why is that so important for this particular church? Well, because of the 2 churches that did not receive a rebuke, they both had heavy burdens of persecution. So we already talked about the church at Smyrna having to face death, looking to the one who has defeated death through its pain even. He encourages Smyrna not to be afraid of the death that they may have to face in the very near future. To Philadelphia, he's saying, you are going to have to deal with one thing that the church in Smyrna and you all are both going to have in common. Your persecution is not necessarily going to come from the outside. It's going to come from other people who claim that they are serving God. Both of these churches are going to be dealing with what Christ himself calls the synagogue of Satan. And what he's saying is, look, no matter who locks you out of the fellowship of the quote unquote righteous in your day, I have the keys that unlock things that no one can shut you out of. And so understand, no matter what persecution you are going through, no matter who it comes from. See, because it's easy for me, if I believe that I'm a Christian walking in proper fellowship with God, to see the persecution that comes out, read the Beatitudes and be like, thank you, God, for allowing me, like the apostles said, allowing me to suffer for the sake of the kingdom. Oh, but when the doubt comes in my mind because I think those who seem righteous are locking me out of the assemblies or the fellowship, then I can begin to doubt, am I really, what's going on? I can have that level of self-examination that may go too far. I had a chance to talk to, I mentioned to you all just yesterday. 2 young Mormon missionaries came by my place yesterday. And I was like, I'm sick. You probably don't want to come in. They're like, no, we're just fine. So we sat and talked about God for a minute. And this thing I said is, brothers, no matter how much we may differ on doctrine, I know what it's like to knock doors and have to deal with the rejection that comes from people not wanting to see you on a Saturday on their time off, away from having to think about stuff. And so if there's no other way, we have a common fellowship. It's an understanding what it's like to be rejected, see? Right? And so that's one level of rejection. It's not easy to take, but it's hard when it comes from within. See, because back then, in this time, the synagogue of Satan was not necessarily identified as the synagogue of Satan until Jesus called it out. See, in the circumstance at that time, they might have been looked at as the standard of righteousness in those communities. And see, understand, there's going to be a time where before God makes a revelation, your drama may come from people who are otherwise viewed as being in the right within the body of Christ. And so you're going to have to learn how to bear up under that kind of isolation and the self-doubt that can work in your own mind when nobody said a word to lift you up. And that's what he's talking to. 2 churches that have been so beaten down that they don't necessarily know whether they're doing it right or doing the right things or serving God anymore either. So how do you bear up before you get that word from God that says, no, the persecution that you're facing is because you are actually doing the right things. He's saying, look, there's a door that no one can shut that I have open for you. And simply take this word from my servant and be encouraged as you continue to bear up under the oppression that you're dealing with. Verse 14, he introduces himself to the church at Laodicea as follows. And to the angel of the church in Laodicea write the words of the Amen, the faithful and true witness, the beginning of God's creation. And understand how we've over and over again, since the time we went through the Psalms, talked about that whole concept of faithful and true. Because he's talking to, as the brother talked this morning, he's talking to a group of lukewarm Christians. And what he is saying is, much like he talked about to the church at Sardis, the question is not how you started, it is, church, how are you going to finish the assignment that God has given you. We've talked about that whole concept of faithful before. Faithful isn't mere presence. Just like the brother this morning talked about, look, if I'm talking about actually being faithful to my wife, I am not talking about how much I can go out, how much at dinner I can get away with flirting with the waitress without making her upset, right? That's not faithful. Faithful is understanding exactly how I can make her feel affirmed in my love for her, right? Faithful isn't so much just being there, showing up, saying I've checked off all my boxes as a father and a dad. And of course, it's easy for the single guy to use all these illustrations, but it was the married preacher who used them, so I'm just borrowing his, right? It's not enough just to have the presence, right? It is the love that actually gives the presence value. And when he's introducing himself as the faithful, he is the one who didn't simply have the presence of being around God. Why? Satan was in God's presence. He was considered to be the most beautiful among the creation. He was there, but his heart was somewhere else. And so what Jesus is saying in introducing himself to the church of Laodicea is don't fall in the same trap of believing that mere presence is enough. Because God, who is the one with the sharp two-edged sword coming from his mouth, the one with the eyes of fire, right? Who has been steeped in the feet, burnished in bronze. He's actually walked through the fire. If you actually, that's one of the things is mentioned before when we were going through the Psalms. I wasn't always a big fan of Floyd Mayweather until somebody started teaching me how to fight in the ring. And I realized what it was like to get hit and then have to stand up when you're tired and exhausted. And so I stopped judging fighters the same way that I did before I'd ever gotten in the ring. And so it became really refreshing in a lot of ways for me to have the pain of defeat. Why? because the agony of defeat gives you a sober perspective that humbles your criticism of others. And so when Jesus is saying he's the one who's actually been through the fire, he's saying, much like he's written to all these different churches, that he has all these different insights. The wounds that he suffered aren't simply for him to show off scars. The wounds are the things that he endured so that he can more effectively empathize with those who he is helping. And that's literally what we studied as, in many ways, the purpose behind Peter when he was writing 1 Peter. If you think you're really going through it, I told those young men yesterday, they're like, well, what's your story? Like, well, how did you get into Christ? And I was like I told you all before, it was some embarrassing questions that I, as the noted Christian in the room, just couldn't answer. My buddy who was looking to marry a Christian woman, he'd been raised in Islam. It's like, Marcus, you're my Jesus friend. Why do I need Jesus? I was like, Dad. I didn't know. Because I spent all my time going to church and just really never investigated why I needed Jesus. Just kind of going through the routine. And so it challenged me to go back and learn more. Why do I need Jesus? Beyond that, there are other questions I would get that I just couldn't answer that somebody who's been in church all their life should probably be able to answer. And so sometimes it's just the embarrassment of not being able to answer basic questions that makes you have to confront. Am I going to make the kinds of excuses that God sees through anyway? He can cut through with a simple question. Or am I going to be honest about the fact that I just need to draw closer to the God who on the outside people see that I serve? And that's what he's confronting each of these groups with. What are you going to do when you are confronted with the shortfall in whatever your ministry might be? And of course, at this point, all I've done is introduce Jesus. We haven't really gotten into what's going on at these different congregations, but understand this. Sometimes maybe that's just the point, right? Ultimately, you've probably heard it before. Maybe it's a good point of discussion for later on. But I really don't have time to go in depth. But what's going on at Ephesus? Well, Ephesus was a church that, if you just look at in brief, let's just take a couple of seconds and go through the dilemma at each of these congregations. Verse 2 at Ephesus in chapter 2. I know your works, your toil and your patient endurance, how you cannot bear with those who are evil, but have tested those who call themselves apostles and are not, and found them to be false. I know that you are, I know you are enduring patiently and bearing up for my name's sake, and you have not grown weary. But I have this against you, that you have abandoned the love that you had at first. Remember, therefore, from where you have fallen. Repent and do the works you did at first. If not, I will come to you and remove your lampstand from its place. Understand comprehensively. We've talked about this before. There are only two churches he threatens with total removal, and this is one of them. Understand, traditionally, this is probably the most doctrinally sound church that he's going to talk to amongst the amongst the seven. Definitely amongst the five that he rebukes. Not necessarily that they're any more doctrinally sound, but it's one of the things that he takes pains to note about them, is that they were able to sort through the false apostles. One of the things he's going to tell us, though, going forward, that will help us understand a little bit more about what the problem might be at this congregation is verse 6. Yet this you have, you hate the works of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate. And understand how this concept of he loved righteousness and hated wickedness is so important. See, because a common hatred is not to be confused with actual love. See, it's good that they hate things that Christ hates, but they began to neglect the affirmative duty to fill in the void with actual love. Why is that so important? See, because while they were noted for their excellence in sorting out those who were false and not adhering to the truth of scriptures, much like we talked about before, if the United States and the USSR came out of World War II thinking they were going to be great buddies, how was that going to pan out? Yeah, it wasn't going to do too well for very long. Why? Because they had a common enemy in the Axis powers, but that didn't mean they had a genuine love for one another. And that's the lesson that we're seeing here. He is warning churches about being preoccupied by the things that they hate and to which they have become opposed, and confusing the camaraderie that comes. You heard the movies? Band of Brothers? That was pretty big, right? Why? Because in a unit of military people fighting on the same side, you have this camaraderie that can form. But one of the other reasons why I like to listen to the veterans talk about what it's like to serve is like, okay, well, when we are not out shooting at the enemy, that's when we have to deal with the fact that we are very different people. And we realize that it's very different to actually love one another than it is to join together with one another to fight a common enemy. And so that's why I like listening to the deeper stories of what it's like to come back home after the battles are done. Because that's when you get to hear those veterans who are willing to open up, talk to you about what it's like to actually have to affirmatively love now that the common enemy is no longer creating that, in some ways, limited bond of peace that we have in times of conflict. And so that's what he's saying. He's like, you've done well to fight against that enemy that wanted to work its way into your assembly. But what you have not done is preserve the true bond of genuine affection within your group. Church of Smyrna, once again, this was not a church that was rebuked, but it was a church that was called to simply bear up under the onslaught that they were to face. Verse 9, I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich. And the slander of those who say that they are Jews, but they are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. And we're not going to go into the details, but we've talked about different belief systems that exist to this day that actually could make this a literal thing. There is a synagogue of Satan. There are people who are biologically Hebrew, but they believe in an offshoot of an offshoot of Judaism that's called Kabbalah that literally twists the creation story and says that God was a created thing. And the person who really is the good guy of the creation story is somebody who's very different than you would think they would pretend it would be. That is a literal, it's a potentially literal application of this verse. But beyond that, whether it's a literal or figurative usage of the term that Jesus is using, the bottom line is these are people who are claiming to worship God that are actually persecuting the people of God. And understand in your own life, one of the things that we all have to confront is, okay, how do I emotionally regulate times when I have either affirmatively been wronged or feel like I have been wronged? Why? Because none of these folks, if you ask them, this people in the synagogue of Satan, the people who were persecuting Jesus, if you had to ask them, was Jesus doing right? No! Nobody's going to admit they're doing wrong. But there's always a great reason to do the wrong thing. And that is why when in each of these letters, and maybe I just have to end here because at some point we just got to go. There's so much to preach. But one of the ties that bind each of these letters is he's going to say, well, is this just to these 7 churches or just people in their time? Jesus is going to tell you who it's to. Back up to chapter 2 when he's talking to Ephesus. Verse 7, he who has an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Fast forward in his recommendations or his words to the church at Smyrna. Verse 11, he who has an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Fast forward to the church at Pergamum, chapter 2, verse 17. He who has an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit has to say to the churches. Then to the church at Thyatira, the very same thing. Verse 29. He who has an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Skipping forward to the church at Sardis, chapter 3, verse 6. He who has an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit has to say to the churches. And of course, again, to the church at Philadelphia, he's going to say much the same thing. In verse 13, he who has an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit has to say to the churches. And then finally to the church at Laodicea in verse 22, he who has an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He's saying, look, if you got an ear to hear it, the litmus test is pretty much, do you want to hear it? And ultimately he's saying, it's not simply those who history has proven to be the quote unquote bad guys of the Bible that need to be worried about this question of, okay, how is it that I respond to situations when I feel that I'm dealing with an adversary? He said it, Paul said it before, that when we are dealing with the enemy, we have to realize that our enemy is not of flesh and blood, but it comes from the spiritual places that lurk behind what we can see. And that's exactly what J.D. Greear was talking about this morning. When he was talking about that whole concept, okay, what is going on in these warnings to these 7 churches? In the Revelation, if you don't know anything else, we talked about those hacks before in these end time prophecies. One is loving truth. He gave us another hack in understanding these end times prophecies. It's understanding that the flesh and blood that you see is not your enemy. It is the spirit that is at work. It has an MO. When police are hunting down criminals, they don't start afresh every new investigation. They got a modus operandi. When the Mormon fellas were coming through yesterday, I was watching one of my murder shows. And I was like, oh, sorry, guys. Got murder show on the TV. You know, probably not good preacher stuff, but I'll put on a fireplace for us to talk Jesus. But it was one of those shows where this guy had a neighbor, and he actually killed his wife. He killed his wife and his kids. And he ultimately ended up going to his neighbor's house when it was still unclear who the suspect was, and they ran back the neighbor's video who caught his driveway. And they were acting normal when it was the police and the guy and his neighbor, but the police are clever. I've worked with them, right? And so they were like, okay, hey, we'll catch you outside. We want to finish up a couple things with your neighbor here. And as soon as the dude left, the neighbor was like, he's not acting normal. It's because they got a short list of suspects when certain folks come up missing. They don't have to reinvent the wheel. They don't have to start all over from scratch, because there is a modus operandi to certain crimes that happen over and over again in human nature. And that is what Jesus is telling us. No matter what you see in the presence of people, there are certain spiritual MOs that are happening over and over again in the spiritual life of the people you are around. So you don't have to pretend this is brand new. That's what the Revelation is talking about. And so when Jesus is saying, he who has an ear to let him hear, I don't have to write to the 1950s church to let you know this brand new thing that Satan's got going on. Because I got 7 churches that, if you really are willing to pay attention and listen to, are probably going to tell you some things that can help you through exactly what it is you're dealing with in your time of whatever situation you're going through. And if you want to hear it, there it is. If you don't, carry on, just like they say in the military, right? And so Jesus, once again, he don't need me to believe him. He don't need me to buy in. He don't need me to necessarily be open to what he's saying. He's simply saying, in love, I am trying to tell you, these are things that have been going on since before you were born, and these are things that are going to go on until my return. And so ultimately, wasn't able to scratch the surface on the revelation, but hopefully in understanding who God is, what we can grasp from these words in these few moments is that once we get a heart that is fixed on doing righteousness, which is hard enough. Why? Because when I'm doing well, righteousness, whatever. See, but I begin to crave righteousness and justice when I'm deprived, and I began to see that over and over in my own character. When I'd be jumping up and down about an injustice that didn't go my way, then I started to realize that sometimes when I would look into the eyes of people who couldn't care less, it was because it wasn't an injustice that they were feeling. And I had to realize, likewise, there were times when there would be an injustice that was going on, and I'd look and I'd be like, It would be because I wasn't necessarily feeling it. But I started to realize that it wasn't because I was losing a sense of injustice. You step on my toes the wrong way, and I'm going to care about justice all over again, right? But the question is, ultimately, do I have the balance to care about it whether or not it's stepping on my toes? And that's what faithfulness is. It is talking about a Christ who didn't have to atone for a single sin. He didn't have to suffer anything to get it, but he did because there was someone else who needed his not only insight, but his love and his patient endurance. Why? Because it's one thing, for, like I've said before, for me to just give you some advice from a cold, emotionally detached place. But it's another thing for me to either appreciate the degree to which I can't really relate to what you're going through and confess that and not give you advice like I know. But it's another thing for me to step outside of my comfort zone to try to understand what you're going through and how much it hurts to actually go through that thing. And so that's the message that we get. So last week when we were talking about, okay, well, why are we preaching Easter from Passover? That's basically what Passover is. It's something that was innocent, a lamb, you having to live with it before you kill it. Why? Because it's helping to give God a sign to pass over, bring death or the consequences that you just deserve as much as the Egyptians, bud, right? And so that's the symbolism that was given when Jesus, in John's gospel, over and over, it's emphasized. He died during the time of Passover. That lamb is simply giving you an indication of the life that Jesus was going to lead. Why? So I could simply say, thanks, Jesus? No, because he was the firstborn from the dead, which means, just like he said, if you are truly my disciple, you will pick up your cross and follow me. He's looking for other people who are willing to suffer and die to help problems they didn't create and problems they aren't necessarily responsible for fixing, but people who have the heart and the courage to step into the void, because that's what he did. And if you really want to say thanks, that's what we're going to do too. So that's what he's reminding us of in the Revelation. He doesn't have to tell us anything, but if he's taking the time to warn us, he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches.